All the best for a healthy, free, and prosperous 2023 from Mike Stenhouse, a Liar to Liberty guy, and all of us here at the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity and the Ocean State Current. Today's episode, only on the current. We're going to get into an interview coming up with Dr. Andrew Bostom in just a few minutes. His case perfectly exemplifies the manipulation that Rhode Islanders, Americans, and citizens across the globe have been subjected to by the government, the media, and the big tech complex, the syndrome of manipulating you, denying you important information, canceling those who put out inconvenient truths, and of course, promoting falsehoods. I think the story of Dr. Andrew Bostom perfectly exemplifies that right here in Rhode Island. A Rhode Island-based epidemiologist, medical research expert, who we first gave some exposure to on this show, on our My in the Dugout show on the Ocean State Current, who told you the truth about COVID and some of the false prescriptions that were put forth and narratives put forth by the government. And he was canceled. He was part of the Twitter file release right around Christmas. His account was finally reinstated at Christmas time. He was mentioned prominently by David Zweig, an author we're going to refer to a lot today, who studied all these Twitter files and what's been going on and how Twitter rigged the COVID debate. But what happened here in Rhode Island is a perfect example of this government media big tech complex. Not only did the government give you false narratives, not only was Andrew Bostom canceled, but the media had zero curiosity in this state, zero integrity, 100% a mouthpiece of the state government and the Rhode Island Department of Health. As we get started with this only on the current episode, again, I remind you, you're not going to hear about the story of Andrew Bostom anywhere else in the Rhode Island media. His story has gone national on multiple outlets and international. Yet nobody but us here on the current dares to touch the story and go against the government narrative. As much as it's been proven to be false, they are still stuck in their ruts, the legacy media. You know, I'm going to refer and I'm going to paraphrase an article from David Zweig on how the government and how Twitter and how the media rigged the COVID debate. So just know that his tweets, his stories are the basis of what I'll have to say, but a lot of this is my own as well. It's supposed to be the job of the press, of the media, to be skeptical of power, especially the power of government. They're supposed to be the fifth estate, we call it, or the fourth estate. I don't even know, the fourth estate. They're supposed to be a check on government. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know that the corporate media, the legacy media, did nothing but promote the government narrative, as false as it was, as ridiculous as it was at time, and they helped shut down voices of dissent. They helped the government violate yours and mine First Amendment rights. Where it leads us is that we, you and me, and all of us have to be vigilant on our own. We're the ones that have to be skeptical and be a check on power and conduct our own due diligence. We cannot count on these institutions anymore. The media, academia, the agencies, they're in lockstep with the government. They purge anyone internal to their organizations who might be a quote dissident. They discredit or cancel outside experts, and they promote false narratives without even a second thought. Early in the COVID debate, Twitter became an alternative. At least people were putting stuff out there on Twitter that seemed to contradict some of the things that we heard from Dr. Fauci and Nicole Alexander Scott here in Rhode Island, and Governor Raimondo here in Rhode Island, and later on Governor McKee and Director McDonald. But Twitter was not an alternative outlet for long. It couldn't be allowed. Those in power couldn't be allowed to allow anything but the establishment narrative. David Zwig, the author we talked about, viewed internal documents, internal emails at Twitter. And you might be surprised to learn this, that it was both the Trump and the Biden administrations who directly pressed Twitter executive to moderate the platform's content according to the government's wishes. Now, the Trump administration, I don't think, was quite as evil as the Biden administration. Trump administration was trying to stop panic. They were trying to keep things calm. They didn't want people to panic. They especially pressed Twitter and other social media groups about panic buying. They didn't want people raiding grocery stores, raiding their bank accounts, any other places that sold, consumer goods, just hoarding. They wanted to stop that. So they tried to downplay a little bit the severity, even though of it. Now, I'm not sure that's misinformation they were putting forth, but in that regard, even the Trump administration pressured Twitter and other social media companies to downplay, quote, the panic. But it was nothing like what the Biden administration was to do. In July 2021, I didn't know this, then U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released a 22-page advisory, this is according to David Zwig, concerning what the World Health Organization referred to as an infodemic. So while the government was promoting the pandemic, World Health Organizations, other health officials throughout other countries, and including here in the United States, including our government, they were trying to stop what they called an infodemic. And the infodemic was really the truth about COVID, the truth about COVID vaccines, the truth about lockdowns, the truth about school mask mandates. They refer to that as an infodemic. You and I refer to it as cancellation of the truth. And as we've said many times, censorship by surrogate. Alex Berenson was one of the first national reporters to start putting out the truth. Biden announced publicly, right after that memo I just read you from then Surgeon General Murthy, that social media companies, get this, social media companies were killing people by allowing that infodemic, that misinformation, as they called it, about vaccines. And just hours later, Twitter would shut down and lock out Alex Berenson for the first time, and then permanently suspend him the next month. Twitter and other groups, I'm sure they set up robots. They had contractors operating throughout the world. And then, of course, they had their senior level executive all conspiring, all working to identify, to flag, to listen to what the government was telling them, government officials who want inconvenient truths and messengers shut down. And this is how it happened. And it happened with Dr. Bostom right here in Rhode Island. And as you'll hear about in just a moment, Dr. Bostom's story is the perfect example of this government media big tech complex. Why is this important? We're not just complaining. The corruption of the media in this state is as corrupt as it is nationally in Washington, D.C. and internationally. They ignored Dr. Bostom's story. They ignored Dr. Bostom's wise and researched words over the last 2 years. And when he was shut down, no one in this media other than us announced it or came to his defense. This isn't simply the story of the power of big tech or of the legacy press or of the government to shape our debate. It certainly is all that. But this corruption, This unconstitutional, immoral, these actions, these unconstitutional, immoral actions have real life consequences. It's not a story about corruption. It's a story of children across the country who are prevented from attending school, from speaking and communicating clearly because they had to wear masks. And we know this especially hurt kids from underprivileged backgrounds who were already behind in their achievement levels compared to their more well-off peers when it comes to math and English and real academic and school issues, subjects, I should say. It's the story, the real life consequence of people. Think of the hundreds of thousands of elderly and others who died alone. Their relatives not allowed to be there with them. Think of the small businesses that were shuttered, the employees that were fired, the drugs, the alcohol use that picked up, the suicides. There's real life consequences when the government puts out false narratives and does not allow open debate. And now here in Rhode Island, there are renewed calls for school and social masking mandates because of the fake triple-demic, the false narrative that is currently being propagated. We talked about this just 2 weeks ago with Dr. Andrew Bostom as well. Another false narrative, the RSV, the flu, and the pandemic. It's all RSV, the hospitalizations anyway of young people. There's no triple-demic. It's a false narrative. It's going to take a long time for us to regain trust in our institutions and our health officials and our government, in the media, and in big tech. You got to wonder what would have happened had Dr. Bostom and so many others across this nation and across the world been able to have had an open forum for real and honest debate about real and relevant research that would have changed the trajectory of how we responded to the COVID pandemic. So let's make a vow this 2023 that we will no longer be manipulated as a people by our government, by the media, by the big tech cabal, that we will move forward and we will continue to seek out the truth on our own. Folks, as a Rhode Islander, if you want to best understand the government, big tech, and media syndrome that caused our nation and our state citizenry to be purposely misled and lied to and even harmed, not negligently, purposefully, about COVID and many of the false narratives put forth by that cabal in that syndrome, there's no need to look any further than the fake and dishonest case of how Dr. Andrew Bostom was canceled. And as we all know now, canceled for telling the truth. Everything that's wrong nationally you've been hearing about is all captured in this story locally. Yet, as we'll get into later, nobody in the local media, other than us here at the Current, wants to cover the story. Andy Bostom, welcome back to the Ocean State Current.
Thanks very much for having me, Mike.
I should also say welcome back to Twitter. On Christmas Day, your account was unsuspended after 5 months in Twitter jail. I don't even know where to begin. Tell the story, Andy. Go ahead.
So I was contacted. The story was sort of foreshadowed to me, and I was contacted about a week or so before, week and a half maybe, before my suspension was ultimately lifted by surprise on Christmas Day, by an outstanding reporter, David Zweig, who's been covering Twitter issues really for left publications and mainstream publications. He writes for the New Yorker. He's an investigative reporter there for many years. He's had pieces written published in the Atlantic, but he has used me for background for many of his stories. politically, David is still a man of the left. But when it came to COVID, he has done some of the most solid, certainly for the mainstream media, the most solid, I would say, investigative reporting. And so he called me up, and he was perseverating on, the one of these tweets that I had put out, I think it was last April, and it was flagged by Twitter. I guess it was eventually used as one of the strikes against me. And he wanted to go over the background on it. And it was simply a slide that I put together that I attached to the tweet. You could attach images to the tweet. Yep. So I put together a slide which showed that pediatric COVID deaths, as reported by CDC, it was all CDC data, Mike, were significantly lower than many recent flu years, whether they were pandemic flu years or more commonly seasonal flu years. And I think I tallied up about 6 years where the annual mortality for pediatric influenza was higher to considerably higher, to many, several fold higher than what had been reported for COVID mortality in 2020 and 2021. And so I walked David through the justifications for that.
And the point being, very simply, you and I have gone through all that many times on our In the Dugout interviews, but as you succinctly summarize here on your tweet, that all you were doing was putting forth evidence-based data, real data, CDC data, that rebutted, as you call it, the warped but accepted narrative, and the only narrative that was allowed for a while out on social media. So you told the truth, you studied and researched data, you put it out there, and you got punished for it, right?
Now, maybe I was a little naive or thick or whatever at the time, but when David was asking me about this, I thought he was more or less commiserating with me, about, isn't that awful, and you're still not back, and blah. Honestly, Mike, I had no idea he was doing this deep dive investigative story along with Barry Weiss, who now has, remember, she's the reporter that left the New York Times because she found it just, unbelievably viciously woke, and she started her own podcast. Now she's got her own media imprint, which is called The Free Press, which is ultimately where David's investigative report appeared. But I had no idea he was doing this investigative report, let alone focusing on me.
All right, now before you go there, can you clarify one thing for me, Andy? David
Sure.
Zweig, was he one of the reporters who was given the files to release, or he's just doing an after the release report on the files?
It's sort of a hybrid. He was invited out with Barry Weiss,
okay,
to actually go out to Twitter and to view files, except his was sort of a niche focusing on scientists in particular who had been either temporarily or permanently banned from Twitter, had experienced what's called shadow banning, etc. So he went through and reviewed cases, and mine was one of the prominent cases that he wound up reviewing.
And as we can see here, like those other reporters, that he put out a series of tweets. You can see number 29 began a series of tweets about you. Exactly. So like those other reporters, he put out since Twitter limits your characters, you have to do it in a lot of different segments, right? So all right. So
but he also wrote a deep dive for
the Free Press, got it.
A long investigative essay for the Free Press. Many of the extracts from his long Twitter thread are pretty much verbatim what appeared in the long essay itself.
You had mentioned earlier 5 strikes.
Right.
That was Twitter's kind of rule, and according to him, and as you have maintained on our show for a long time, only 4 out of the 5 were definitely not valid.
Well, but the humorous, if there is any humor to this, the humorous part about this is that was determined by the great Twitter savants, whoever they are, themselves. In other words, I was not in violation of their own rules, because you have to have 5 at least Twitter legitimate strikes, to be permanently suspended.
That's their rules.
That's their rules. That's their rules. So when I was first, I had 2 suspensions, Mike. So when I was first suspended for simply, and we talk about this, for simply reiterating, paraphrasing, and at least part of the tweet was a direct quote, a paper in the Journal of Andrology, and I actually understated the findings, which suggested that amongst Israeli semen donors, healthy young men, there was a decline in their sperm count and their sperm motility, the ability for the sperm to swim, after with vaccination. And in fact, I downplayed because some of their statistical analyses suggested that it didn't rebound back to normal, that it persisted for some weeks out.
All right, so was that finding the one that was the one valid strike?
No. So
No.
what happened with that? No, that was invalid.
That was
even when I think her name was Gade, very, very woke, very, very strident Twitter legal counsel, was in her position. I got Alex Berenson's counsel because I was upset, being suspended. And he wrote a letter, and I was, as soon as they received the letter, literally within hours of receiving the letter, I was back on Twitter. So that suspension, and they apologized. They said that it was not invalid.
back to when? Last
It was
spring?
June. That was June.
June. Okay, yeah.
It's late June. And then so I'm back on Twitter. I have no idea about what other machinations are going on. And 2 weeks later, I'm suspended again. And this time it's for simply reiterating that the randomized controlled trial data on the COVID vaccines in children and in health and in average risk adults don't demonstrate the ability within the trial design, the ability of the vaccines to prevent hospitalization. And so that resulted in what wound up being a 5-month suspension. But according to David's reporting, that too was not found to be valid when they went, because they were sent a second legal letter with that second suspension, and apparently they vetted whatever my file had. I mean, it sounds like the Stasi, Mike. I mean, they have a file on you, but they determined internally that these were not really violations. So again, Mike, it begs the question as to why the second suspension was A, ever initiated, and B, sustained for 5 months. But what David concludes his little section is, it's a long essay and I'm just a small part of it. He says, even the fifth strike, which was about the what we just talked about the comparison of COVID and flu mortality in children. He said that wasn't valid either. It just violated a narrative. But let's just use their standard again. That means I only had one strike. Is it valid?
And it's supposed to take 5, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So that was the gist of David's reporting about how absurd it was and how arbitrary it was that they were violating their own guidelines for suspension.
All right. Now, Zweig says here that your tweet was flagged by a bot, probably affirmed manually by a staff member.
Right.
But like you said, that would only be one strike against you. So Here's my question. We know that federally, through the release of Twitter files, all the various 8 or 9 dumps now, that the government, the FBI in particular, Justice Department, colluded with Twitter and with other social media accounts, basically saying, hey, here's some accounts we want suspended. Do you have any reason to believe that any federal agency or Rhode Island agency, look, you were on the naughty list of the Rhode Island Department of Health, Governor McKee, Governor Raimondo, the media said, Dan York and others didn't want to hear from you. You were on a lot of people's naughty list for being truthful. Do you have any reason to believe that anybody in Rhode Island or any level of government reported you?
David Zweig could not. I mean, obviously he was looking for things like that. Attached to my file, and given his limited ability, he was time constrained. He was not allowed to just, sit there and go through their archives. He had a very limited time constraint. It kind of reminded me of when Vladimir Bukovsky was given, the great Soviet dissident, the late great Soviet dissident, was given access to the KGB files. Yeltsin let him in there, but it was very short period of time, and he wound up doing like a Sandy Berger. He wound up stuffing documents into his pants, and getting out of there with a very limited, view of what actually happened, but some important revelations. So what I had surmised was that perhaps it was some intervention, maybe Dr. Jha, who I've been very critical of, and in fact was critical of within 24 hours of each of my 2 suspensions out on Twitter. But I have no evidence for that. I am part of this litigation through the Attorney General of Missouri and Louisiana. But it's a very slow process. I filed what's called a declaration, which, if they have the time, they will explore. And now they have very powerful discovery in place where they would be able to get, emails if they existed. But at this point, Mike, I have to be honest, there's no smoking gun evidence of a direct intervention. It's just
right.
what David found.
All right, now this is speculation too, but I believe firmly, and I think we just saw some evidence of it last week, that your findings, as we persistently put forth on our In the Dugout show, as you put forth on Twitter, as others, in the like the Parents United Rhode Island group, as came out in the trial, the Southwell versus McKee trial, you exposed the lies. You exposed the lack of science behind these mandates. And I firmly believe it led to McKee's eyes being opened a little bit when and I believe he fired Nicole Alexander Scott. I believe your findings and the public pressure we all, led by you, but we all put on the then director, James McDonald, caused him to resign as well. He said to spend more time with his family, but guess what? Just last week, he took the same job, and he didn't want to spend more time with his family. He wanted to get away from you, me, and everybody else who was applying pressure. So even though, here's my point, even though you were suspended from Twitter, your findings, I think, had some very, very big and important impacts here in Rhode Island. What do you say to that?
I don't know, Mike. I mean, we'll see if the story ever really, is revealed and unfolds completely. What I will say, and I'd like to segue into this, is that we really do need to talk about, because it's not just the Department of Health, it's not just the Dean of the School of Public Health, Dr. Jha. They have been abetted. They have been facilitated by the local media, and that is a problem. And I'd like to give you some examples of what.
Hold on 1 second, because that's how I introduced you. The government, big tech, and media syndrome, where they all conspired to push only one narrative and to shut down or to ignore anybody else who was pushing a different narrative like you. So yeah, so this story, your based because of the reporting of David Zwig and the release of the Twitter files, you were mentioned in there. You're the local case of what's been happening nationally. Your story has gotten national, international attention, but yet this interview you're doing here will be the first local coverage.
Yes.
Of a huge story with a local angle. And it just shows how the legacy media in this state just continues to stick its head in the sand and support the now provenly fake and false government narrative. All right, which example you want to talk about first?
Well, I did, yeah, but just to bolster your point, the New York Post ran a story which specifically highlighted my plight, again, as part of David Zweig's reporting. The Daily Mail did the same. The Daily Caller.
There's the New York Post. What can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, it's basically refers to me in light of exactly what David Zweig reported. I'm one of the people that was featured in his report, and it starts off, of course, with Alex Berenson, moves on to some other people that I know, including Martin Kuldorf, and then it talks about me specifically. Same thing with the Daily Mail piece. They're really structured.
This is England now. This story,
That's right.
You're making
right.
news in England, yet nobody else here
Right.
other than us will cover this in Rhode Island. It's
Right.
amazing.
And
It's
the basic structure of these two stories in the Post, and now you've got the one displayed in the Mail, is to walk people through David Zweig's Twitter thread, through his essay, and of course, since it features me, I mentioned in both these pieces. The Daily Caller, which is again a more conservative outlet, did an entire story on me. This was a very good background story. I spent probably about an hour discussing the situation with one of their reporters who wrote the story, and it's an in-depth story. But this is exactly the kind of thing, Mike, that one would suspect that should have happened locally. I should have been interviewed for print media and the Projo. I should have had an interview with, I don't know, Gene Valicenti, with one of the local talking heads, and have a full discussion of this story. Obviously not as long as I'm having with you now, but to give it, to give Rhode Islanders some sense of what happened to, I had a 25-year academic career here in Rhode Island. I brought in an enormous grant that was trumpeted in the Projo and certainly by Brown University, that lasted for 10 years. It was almost a $20 million grant. I've been a highly credible academic physician in this area for a long time, and this is what was done to me, and so the examples, I think we should.
Andy, there's another example. You were on what is now the part 2 of the Rush Limbaugh show, the Clay and Buck show. You were on with guest host Todd Herman,
right?
So
and
you were on national radio as well. You had a 9-minute segment.
Right, and as much as people will vilify the Limbaugh show when he was alive, and now Clay and Buck, I mean, it is, I think, by all accounts, one of the most popular radio shows in the country. So vilify it all you may. It just points.
What does it say about? I know Matt Allen, I think, has expressed some interest, and Matt, you've called into Matt regularly. Right. But other than us here at the Current, which is probably, I assume, the only deep dive interview in local media you've had, and you'll probably get a segment with Matt Allen. Other than that, how does it make you feel about the reporting and the legacy media here in this state?
Well, it's a self-fulfilling situation. It's a closed circle. So I wanted to give you some examples. There was right before Ed Acorn left the Providence Journal as the editorial page editor, quote unquote, due to cutbacks, whatever it was. I researched with him, the story about the modeling in going back to the spring of 2020. And Ed was able to produce a story which showed that the modeling was absolutely hysterical in terms of how many people would be hospitalized with COVID during the first wave. It was 6 to 12-fold above what actually happened with hospitalizations. And as Ed pointed out in the story, this was not a model that was made, I don't know, say in January, and here you are at the end of April and early May when hospitalizations peak. This was a model that was literally released in 2 weeks before the peak actually occurred. And yet, other than his piece, and curious,
and it was a grossly inaccurate model.
Coincidentally or not, Ed was gone after that piece appeared. There was no local follow-up. Fast forward, so that was the spring of 2020.
Zero curiosity. I mean, you listen to the press conferences that Raimondo and McKee and Nicole Alexander Scott and James McDonald and others would have. Not one, other than maybe our friend at Coalition Radio, right over there, Pat Ford. Not one curious, intellectually curious question.
And let me remind you of the numbers, what they were. So that the Raimondo Brown University Rideau model predicted that by the end of April, beginning of May, there could be anywhere between, in the conservative model, about 2,300 to the less conservative model, 4,300 patients hospitalized for COVID, in which would have, the 2,300 would have filled the bed capacity of the state. The 4,300 would have required about 2,000 additional beds in
field hospitals. Yeah.
Right. The peak, Mike, was under 400, if I'm remembering correctly.
And that was only temporarily reached.
Yeah, it was about 375. So the model.
Nobody questioned it.
None of the mainstream media, said, "Well, how did you get this?"
Do we know now who made that model? Who was behind it?
We don't even know that.
Nobody asked.
Ed left it. The only information he could get was that it was a collaboration between Brown University, the Department of Health. That's all he could get. So biostatisticians and epidemiologists had put that model together, and they collaborated between Brown and the Department of Health. Well, fast forward, Mike, do you remember the first reports with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? It's the so-called adenovirus vector vaccine. When it was introduced, there were some horrific cases. They were, thank God, mercifully rare, but there were some horrific cases, including in healthy young women. There was an obstetrician, a male, who died of this horrible syndrome, excuse me, where you get the almost paradoxical combination of clotting, massive clotting, and bleeding.
Yep.
And bleeding, particularly in the circulation to the brain. And so deaths were recorded and severe disability. I was interviewed, to her credit, by Erica Ricci of WPRI. She reached out to me because I had been writing about this, tweeting about this phenomenon, and we did a face-to-face interview. I remember it very distinctly because she actually did it. I had to rush to do the interview because we were literally going down to Florida to visit my mom, and I had to set aside time. And my wife was yelling at me in the background, to hurry up. But we spent a half hour together. I went over that, and I also gave her a complete scoop. It would have been a great scoop for her, and she wound up being very angry at her producers because of what ultimately happened. I told her that the Israeli
this is Erica Ricci at Channel 12.
WPRI, and this is March of 2021. So two things happened. I also alluded to the fact that the Israelis were now, their Ministry of Health was reporting in young men the first cases of mRNA vaccine, so the Pfizer vaccine, myocarditis, inflammation of the heart in young men, some serious cases, hospitalizations, ICU hospitalizations, and that was completely new to her. And so we went over those two things, and after the interview was taped, but before it was scheduled to be aired, so the same day, there was the pause. If you remember, there was a brief pause. The FDA paused the administration of the Johnson & Johnson adenovirus vaccine because of what I had described. Her producers and the powers that be at WPRI spiked the entire interview and would not let her,
Never aired, right? Never aired.
Never aired.
All right, so let's summarize. So not only did they fail to ask critical questions and honest questions when there were obvious problems with what the administration was saying, not only did they ignore you and other narratives from people, learned people like you and others, who went against the government's storyline, but when they were served a story on a platter for one resourceful reporter and Erica Ricci, like you said, they killed it. They killed it.
And there's an incident that happened before that, but this was for the print media.
Yep.
So if you recall, when kids were first going back to school with all the masking in place and everything, so pre-vaccine, but after the first wave in the fall of 2020, there was lots of controversy about sports participation. Indoor sports, outdoor sports, the necessity of masking,
testing, all that stuff.
Right. So again, to his credit, Jim Hummel tracked me down for a story he was writing for the Providence Journal, and he on 3 separate occasions, phone interviews. So I must have spent about a total of an hour to an hour and a half time with him. And we went over very carefully, a colleague, someone that I've come to know now, certainly, who's a pediatrician and epidemiologist, Tracy Beth Hogue, had gotten hold of a data set from the state of Wisconsin, which looked at sports activities and the rates of—
Yeah, we covered that on our In the Dugout with you. Yep.
The rates of infection. And what was unique about the Wisconsin data is that, you know, they've got a state that's not, you know, just dyed in blue. They had school districts where they didn't enforce anymore during sports participation.
Yeah.
She had a mask, unmasked control group, and there, of course, there were no differences in infection rates. And so Jim and I talked about those data, about more broadly about so much of what we've talked about.
And what, it never made it in the paper?
The randomized controlled trial data on masking. What happened, it was even worse. Jim called me up very sheepishly and said, look, I'm sorry, but they don't like you, is the way he sort of characterized it at the Providence Journal. And every reference to you and most of the material you gave me had to be excised from the piece.
Well, all right. So they don't like you. Shoot. Forget the message. It's all about the messenger, right? Even though, well, I had the same experience, and so did you on Dan York. I'll never, and I'm going to bring up, in my case, the Dan York issue.
Right.
Not on my show. When I started to put forth some of the data, I forget what his topic was, is how do we decide, how do school districts decide whether or not they should have mask mandates or not, or something like that. And I called in and said, well, you just got to look at the data that Dr. Bostom put out and others, that they don't work. Not on my show. We're not going to talk about that on my show. Not on my show. Dan York, not on my show, York. I mean, just these attitudes. All right, Andy, I want to go one more area with you to close out our interview. And this is, I think, why what we just talked about is so important. I'm going to show you two images, and I'm going to show our audience here as well. Hold on one second.
Mike, you went silent. Sound is off. Sound is off. Sound is off.
I actually hit mute when I went to hit share screen. Okay. Thank you for that.
Can you go back to that?
So Dr. Jha from Rhode Island, from Brown, who's now the Biden's COVID advisor, he's now admitted there, talking about student masking, there is no study in the world that shows that masks work. Okay. You and I know that. We've talked about that for a year and a half or two here. Now,
Mike, can I pause just for a second?
Yeah, no, wait a minute. I got to make this point.
He's come back and contradicted himself yet again and said, but anyway, I didn't really mean that,
Well, James McDonald couldn't talk about one when he was on the stand in the trial. Nobody's been able to put out one. But this is why it's important, because there's talk again about masking students again. The talk is out there.
Right.
And look at this poll I found. Democrats still overwhelmingly support masking toddlers. There's like 56% of Democrats say, yeah, we should mask young kids under 5 years old if they're in daycare or school or something like that. So here's the point, Andy. Because you were shut down and others, because the media refused to cover the story, whether it was proactively or whether they canceled stories like Channel 12 did with the Erica Ritchie piece, or just failed to look at all the information we put out based on your research and others, the public still does not understand. The public has been lied to so much. They've been shielded from the truth so much that that naive and negligent school officials and parents still believe that masking is the way to go. And you and I know, and studies show, masking young kids for a long period of time actually harms them physically, emotionally, educationally. This is not just canceling somebody. This is harmful to our society, what this big tech, media, and government cabal has done. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and the tragedy is that views like Dr. Jha's, whether it's on masking children or masks in general or vaccination, Mike, would never withstand the kind of scrutiny that you would get in a fair public debate. Let me give you an example. Dr. Jha wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post in November of 2021, literally comparing, and we've discussed this, but literally comparing polio as an illness and polio vaccination in children to COVID as an illness and COVID vaccination in children. And it was a pure propaganda piece. And so I responded to it at my blog through the Ocean State Current. But now that I'm back on Twitter, I brought that back to the public's attention. And, now that thanks to Twitter and the suspensions, I now have, over 60,000 followers. So that may get more currency now that this has all happened. But the point is, Mike, it's very simple to show, using historical information, even from the state of Rhode Island, just how just the level of dangerous propaganda it is to make that comparison. Real quick, in 1953, as reported in the then Newport Daily News, just through the end of October, there were 15 deaths from only 289 cases of polio in 10 months in children, primarily. We haven't had a death from COVID in this state for the entire course of the pandemic. Right. The trial that Jha was comparing, although he didn't refer to it in his op-ed, the polio vaccine trial enrolled 1.8 million children, about 1.3 million.
That's how you do a trial.
Yeah, 1.3 million were in the true, either you get the active injection, you get a placebo injection, and then there were about another 500,000 just observational controls, but 1.8 million children. That trial, that true trial, prevented 374 cases of crippling polio. At the time that Jha wrote his op-ed in November of 2021, the data that were available in children were from a small Pfizer trial of 2,300 versus 1.8 million. And there wasn't a single hospitalization in the entire study. And what happened? They prevented 13 cases of sniffles.
Yes, yeah, we talked about that, sniffles, yeah.
So this is the level of propaganda that this man was.
Well, it's dangerous. I mean, like we said, it's dangerous because people are still thinking that a failed prescription is the way to move forward, and all they're going to do is harm their kids. All right, Andy, we've got to close up here. Look, we're going to have you back as a guest on In the Dugout soon to talk about more, but we wanted to tell your Twitter story. We wanted to talk about not just from the cancellation point of view, but the lack of local coverage in this just corrupt local media. And like we just closed, talk about the implications. I mean, this could be an uninformed public and uninformed policymakers can have really severe negative health consequences for our students and our citizens, and it's all because of this cabal that shut you and so many others across the nation down. Final thought to you, Andy.
Yeah, I think we have to have an analogous process within the state as Twitter is going through. In other words, we have to be able to get not only my story out, but many other stories out, and force the local media somehow, if it's possible, to cover them, or to set up debates. You've offered, I think Matt Allen has offered, for example, for me to debate some COVID issues with some of the public health savants and people like Dr. Rani and even Dr. Jha. It's imperative that this take place, but more importantly, I'm making the offer. I'll sit down with any of these local media people that do, longer format interviews, and describe what happened to me at Twitter and what its local ramifications are, because that's what's really important for local.
That's right. The ramifications are the most important thing, anyway. All right. Andy Bostom, thanks for joining us on Only on the Current. We'll see you on In the Dugout soon.
Bye.
All right, folks. So, look, our nation is being divided in so many ways. we've talked about the white supremacists, that what they're teaching our kids in school, but we're also being divided according to what news we watch, or whether we're industrious enough to ask questions and do our own research. So many people who obviously just watch the left wing and legacy media are completely unaware that masking and vaccines have significant harm potential, far more so than any other nationally prescribed, remedy to a pandemic ever has in the past. You're being manipulated, you're being lied to. And unfortunately, we have a lot of policymakers, we have a lot of elected officials, and we have a lot of citizens who just don't care, who just are not intellectually curious enough to find out the truth. And it's getting dangerous now. It's getting dangerous. Our nation is not only being divided philosophically, but according to whether we watch the real news or the fake news. And that's why you watch us here on the Ocean State Current. You might not agree with our perspectives on things, but you're not going to get any fake news here. You're going to get the inconvenient truth if you have an opposing view, or but when you hear information on this channel, you're going to know it's accurate. You might not agree with our analysis of it, but the information will be. So again, Dr. Boston has used the Ocean State Current, in the dugout interview, this Ocean State only on the current interview, to get the truth out to you. And right now, there's a real question as to whether or not there's going to be mask mandates again for students. And if the real truth can get out there, people will realize, well, that's not the way to go. This is why it's important. This is why you tune in. This is why we do what we do. So again, thanks for watching Only on the Current. We'll see you coming up soon on our next episode. Mike Stanos out.